We're experiencing a significant series of pandemics right now. For example, there's a significant pandemic of distrust. People just today, particularly in the West, well, we're around the world too, they just have grown to the place where they just don't trust one another. And we feel that. We feel that there's a growing sense of, I don't believe this person. It's more divided than it's probably been in a long time. So we feel that. I think there's a pandemic of defamation from technology. You can, most churches in the world where people are on social media are one social media post away from an emergency staff meeting. And anyone can say anything. And it has, in some sense, given people permission to speak truth to power. It's flattened the world, is the technical term. But that reality is that it can cause some pretty challenging circumstances when people can just say things without consequence. So there's a pandemic of that, and we see it. Social media is a big part of that. I think there's a pandemic of disorientation in identity. People are unsure who they are. They're unsure. And sometimes, when I say identity nowadays, people think about gender identity, and I certainly think that's part of it. I think that's become a major issue in the last 5 years. But, who are we as, people, maybe a minority, maybe a person of color? Where do I fit into the larger church? Who am I as, if I live in the West, what does it mean for the West? What does it mean and more? So I think people are sort of unsure who they are and why ultimately that matters. I think there's a pandemic of division, and this has actually gotten down into our churches, where churches are probably more divided, or at least they were a few years ago. And most churches have had people sort of leave mad in the last few years and maybe go to other churches that are more kind of ideologically aligned where they are. So we sort of feel that reality is ultimately there. And I think at the end of the day, we just we feel that the world is a different place right now. And I think acknowledging that we're in some really unprecedented times, unlike anything we've seen maybe in the West. There are certain times, like if you're in Europe, 1989 was a very disruptive time. The fall of the Berlin Wall, fall of the communist bloc, and you felt that. And there were like 2 or 3 years where like everything was just upended, or 4 or 5 years. Maybe if you're in the UK or in the US, it's 1968, and you kind of felt this cultural disruption all around us. Well, I think we're walking through a cultural disruption like that that's unlike anything I've experienced in my lifetime. And it's probably the hardest time that most leaders will lead. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it's in the midst of those disruptive times, these pandemics of different kinds. We're not through it yet, I don't think, and maybe it's a few more years. It doesn't last forever because you can't have this divided a cultural moment. But the reality is it really takes some discernment to sort of navigate through some of those times. And I think we're living in disruptive times, and that requires us to draw closer to the Lord, to draw closer to one another, to be like the people of Issachar. It's an obscure verse in the Old Testament. They discerned the times and knew therein what they should do. And I think right now we need God's people in the midst of these different pandemics in culture to discern the times and know what we should do.